Today's exposition comes from Romans chapter 5, verse 1, which reads, "Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ." So when Paul begins this verse with the words, "Therefore, having been justified by faith," he is essentially looking back to the case that he has previously made, namely that all of humanity has sinned and is guilty before God. We see that in most of chapters 1 through 3. But that God, in His great grace, has sent His Son to be the wrath-appeasing offering to pay the penalty on behalf of sinners like us. We see that towards the end of chapter 3. And most immediately, that the way in which God has conferred forgiveness and granted righteousness is, and has always been, through the instrumentation of faith. It's as though the Apostle Paul were saying, it's not a radical thing to think that God would call men and women to believe on the person and work of Jesus Christ, and that through faith they would receive forgiveness, because it's always been the way in which God has conferred forgiveness and granted righteousness. Paul referenced Old Testament examples in chapter 4, like Abraham and David. He cited Old Testament scriptures, and now he turns his attention towards some of the blessed benefits of justification, i.e., being declared righteous in the sight of God. The most immediate of which is of immeasurable worth, is found in verse 1 of this chapter. We have peace with God. Now, to understand the blessedness of that reality in the present, we must understand the enmity that existed in the past. Prior to knowing Christ, the Bible describes us as being by nature children of wrath. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 3. We're described as being alienated from God and enemies in our mind against Him through wicked works. Colossians chapter 1, verse 21. We're described as those who had no hope. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12. We're described as having been condemned. John chapter 3, verse 18. And we were described as being those upon whom the wrath of God abided. John chapter 3, verse 36. In our sinful arrogance, we built our lives around ourselves, and we treated God as though He were our butler instead of our king. And God was not indifferent to our sin. He didn't apathetically look upon our transgressions as though it was not a severe affront to His holiness. To use language from the Psalms, it's as though the God who is angry with the wicked every day, Psalm chapter 7, verse 11, had His bow of justice and judgment ready, and we were the prospective targets of His arrows. A cursory reading of both the Old and New Testament will remind an individual that being at enmity with God is a frightful place to be, and such was our state. We were not only sinful, we were rebels. But God, according to His great eternal plan and mercy, purposed to bring a people from enmity to peace. And notice how that peace would come: through our Lord Jesus Christ. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus, the Son sent by the Father, turned the Father's anger and satisfied His justice on behalf of all who would look upon Him alone for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus made the forgiveness of His people both possible and certain through the blood of the cross. Colossians chapter 1, verse 20. The arrows of divine justice were indeed fired, but the repentant can rejoice because they landed upon Jesus. So for all who look upon Him alone for the forgiveness of sins, enmity with God is gone. Hostility no longer exists. And where wrath once abided, there now only abides peace.